The room went silent when Fannie Bell stood up. Not the polite silence of deference, not the hushed quiet of a crowd waiting for the next speaker. This was the silence of 30 men who had suddenly realized, with something between shock and fury, that the woman at the back of Caldwell County's cramped land hearing room had just called the county assessor a liar to his face. John Carver did not move. He sat at the long oak table near the front, one hand resting flat on the surface, the other loose at his side, and he kept his eyes fixed on the window across the room as if the dust-bleached street of Ellsworth, Kansas, in the autumn of 1873 held something more interesting than whatever was unfolding behind him. People in Ellsworth had learned, over the 3 years he had been there, that John Carver's stillness was not disinterest. It was containment. Like a river held behind a dam of sheer, practiced will, he had not spoken once during the 2-hour hearing. He had not needed to. His land claim was ironclad, filed properly, witnessed by 2 men whose names carried weight in the county. He was going to walk out of this room with the deed to 300 acres of creek-fed grassland, and he had known that before he sat down. But the woman would not stop talking. "The survey you filed with this court," Fannie Bell said, her voice carrying the sharp, clean precision of someone who chose every word the way a surgeon chose a blade, "is fraudulent. Not mistaken, not approximate, fraudulent. And I can prove it with mathematics you may find uncomfortable." Judge Harold Pratt, a red-faced man with the look of someone perpetually inconvenienced by the truth, leaned forward over his raised desk. "Miss Bell, you have had your allotment of speaking time. I suggest you sit down before I have Marshal Yates remove you." "Remove me if you like," she said, and the terrifying thing, the thing that made even the veteran cattle brokers in the back row shift in their seats, was that she sounded utterly calm, not reckless, not hysterical, calm the way a storm is calm when it is still gathering itself. "But the survey will still be fraudulent when I am gone, and the 47 families who were displaced by it will still be homeless, and the record of this hearing will still contain my objection, which I intend to make fully and completely before anyone removes me from anywhere." John Carver turned his head. He could not have explained why. He had sat through cattle disputes, water rights battles, boundary fights that ended in drawn pistols. He had heard women speak in public before, though not often and not in places like this. But something in the texture of her voice made him turn, the same instinct that made him turn when he heard a distant sound on the prairie that did not belong. She was not what he expected. She stood at the back of the room holding a leather satchel and a rolled survey document, and she was dressed plainly, in a dark blue wool dress that had been mended at the cuffs, and her dark hair was pinned up with the no-nonsense efficiency of a woman who did not have time to fuss over it. She was perhaps 28 years old, perhaps a year or two either side of that, and she had the kind of face that made you look twice, not because it was conventionally striking, but because there was so much happening behind her eyes that you could not quite look away. She was looking directly at him, not at the judge, not at the assessor whose face had gone the color of old brick, at John Carver, as if she knew exactly what she intended to say next and intended to say it to him specifically. "The man sitting at the front table," she said, and her voice did not waver, "has filed a claim on 300 acres that includes 60 acres already legally settled by the Holt family, who have been working that land for 2 years. I have the original Holt survey. I have the triangulation measurements, and I have the calculations that show the overlap, to the decimal, in a format that any literate person in this room can verify." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. John Carver felt something move through him that he had not felt in a long time, something that started in his chest and moved outward into his limbs like current through water. It was not anger. It was something more complicated and more dangerous than anger, because he recognized it as the thing he had sealed away a decade ago on a battlefield in Virginia with the bodies of men he had commanded lying around him in the blood-soaked grass, men who had trusted him, men he had led, and then lost. It was the feeling of being seen. He had come to Ellsworth with a dark past and a sealed heart, and he had built a life here that required neither to be examined. He owned land, he ran cattle, he kept to himself. He had a reputation for being the coldest man in Caldwell County, and he had cultivated that reputation deliberately, the way a farmer cultivates a fire break, to keep things out, to keep the fire from spreading. But Fannie Bell was looking at him as if she could see through the fire break entirely, and she was right about the survey. He knew she was right because he had not looked closely enough at the original filing when he made his claim. He had trusted his surveyor. He had trusted the county records, and he had been wrong to trust them, and he had wronged the Holt family without knowing it, and the knowledge of that settled into him like a stone into still water. He stood up. The room stirred again. Judge Pratt looked alarmed. Marshal Yates near the door straightened instinctively. "Let her finish," John Carver said. That was all he said. 3 words quiet as the sound a hammer makes just before it falls. But his voice carried the kind of authority that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the absolute certainty that he would not be ignored. Judge Pratt opened and closed his mouth. "Let her finish," John Carver repeated. Fannie Bell looked at him for a moment longer. Something shifted in her expression. Not softness, not gratitude. Something more complex than either, as if she was recalculating something she had already calculated and arriving at a different answer than she expected. Then she opened her satchel, drew out her papers, and began. She had come to Ellsworth 6 weeks ago, and the story of how she arrived there was the story of everything she was and everything she had survived, and it began not in Kansas but in Ohio. Fannie Bell had grown up in Columbus, Ohio, the eldest daughter of a land surveyor named Robert Bell, who had taught her his trade the way another man might teach a son, because he had no sons, and because Fannie had inherited his gift for spatial reasoning and mathematical precision, with a keenness that left him in no doubt of what she was capable of. She could read a land survey by the time she was 14. She could run a transit line and plot a triangulation by the time she was 16. By the time her father died of a fever in the winter of 1866, when she was 21, she was as skilled a field surveyor as any man who worked for the General Land Office, and she knew it, and the General Land Office knew it too, which is precisely why they refused to hire her. She was a woman. The fact that she could outperform most of the men on their payroll was not, in their estimation, relevant. She spent 4 years in Columbus taking in drafting work, preparing survey documents, correcting errors in filed claims that other surveyors had made, and building a reputation among land attorneys as someone whose calculations were never wrong. It was enough to survive on. It was not enough to live on. And Fannie Bell, who had inherited from her father not just his mathematical gift but his restlessness and his eye for the horizon, wanted more than survival. In 1870 she had heard about the Homestead Act, about the land being opened in Kansas, about the families streaming west with nothing but the nerve to try. She heard too about the fraud that accompanied the land rush, the surveyors who accepted bribes to mismark boundary lines, the county assessors who filed falsified records that displaced settlers from land they had legally claimed. She had seen it in Ohio. She knew what it looked like. She knew how to prove it. She came west with a transit, a chain, a set of drafting instruments, and the understanding that her skills were both her livelihood and her weapon. She had been working in Kansas for 3 years by the autumn of 1873, operating out of a rented room in Ellsworth, taking survey correction work from settlers who could not afford a lawyer, but could afford a sliding scale payment that she adjusted depending on how desperate the case appeared. She had helped 14 families recover land they had been fraudulently displaced from. She had a working relationship with 2 land attorneys in town, a cautious professional respect from the federal land agent in Abilene, and a reputation among the county assessors of 3 Kansas counties that made several of them deeply uncomfortable whenever her name came up. The Holt family had come to her in September. Thomas Holt, a gaunt, honest man of 35 with a wife and 4 children, had shown her his paperwork and told her that the county was claiming his family's 2-year homestead was part of a larger claim filed by a man named John Carver, who ran cattle on the range north of the creek. Fannie Bell had looked at the documents for 45 minutes. Then she had looked up at Thomas Holt and told him to be at the land hearing on October the 3rd and to bring his family. She had spent the intervening 2 weeks with her instruments, her calculations, and the county survey records, and what she found was not a simple boundary error. It was a deliberate fraud. The county assessor, a man named Vincent Greer who had been appointed through political connections rather than merit, had accepted payment to file a falsified survey that extended John Carver's boundary south by 60 acres, absorbing the Holt homestead into the Carver claim. The falsification was sophisticated enough to escape casual notice. It was not sophisticated enough to escape Fannie Bell's notice. The question she could not answer from her paper calculations was whether John Carver himself was part of the fraud or simply a man who had trusted the wrong county official. It was a question that mattered to her. She was meticulous about the truth in all its dimensions, and she did not intend to accuse a man of complicity he might not have. She had her answer when he stood up in that hearing room and told Judge Pratt to let her finish. A guilty man, or a man who had bought the fraud deliberately, did not do that. She filed her calculations with the court in full that afternoon, standing at the front of the room with her documents spread across the assessor's table, walking through the triangulation measurements point by point, her voice steady and precise, her hands moving over the survey lines with the certainty of someone who has rehearsed not because she is nervous, but because the truth deserves precision. She explained the discrepancy. She showed the corrected boundary. She named the overlap. And she placed before the judge a signed affidavit from a federal surveyor in Abilene who had reviewed her calculations and confirmed them. Judge Pratt, who was not a dishonest man but was a cautious one who preferred a quiet life to a principled one, looked at the paperwork for a long time. Then he looked at Vincent Greer. Then he looked at the papers again. "I am going to need to recess this hearing," he said finally, in the voice of a man who has just discovered that the comfortable chair he has been sitting in has a nail sticking up through the cushion. "Of course," Fannie Bell said pleasantly, gathering her documents. "I will be available for any questions the court requires. I am renting a room at the Clover Street boarding house. My door is open to anyone with a legitimate inquiry." She picked up her satchel and walked out of the hearing room into the October afternoon. John Carver found her in the street outside. She had stopped to look at something in her satchel, checking the order of her documents with the methodical attention of someone who would not rest until everything was properly filed. She heard his boots on the boardwalk and looked up, and she did not step back or look uncertain, which told him something about her. "You were right," he said. She studied him for a moment. Up close, he was a larger presence than she had registered from across the hearing room. He was perhaps 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something angular and controlled, with dark brown eyes that held a flatness she recognized as the particular blankness of a man who has learned to keep his interior life absolutely private. He was dressed for practicality, not for show, the way men who actually work the land dress, in heavy canvas trousers and a worn gray shirt, and a hat that had seen several years of hard use. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on many men's faces in professional circumstances. He was not condescending. He was not angry. He was not performing the particular kind of stiff courtesy that men used when they wanted to acknowledge a woman without actually crediting her. He was looking at her with direct, unguarded respect, as if the category she occupied in his understanding was not woman who spoke at a hearing, but simply person who was correct. "I know I was right," she said. "The question I have for you is whether you knew what was in your survey filing before this morning." "No," he said. "I did not." "You trusted Greer." "I trusted Greer. That was my error and I take responsibility for it." She waited to see if there was more. There was. "I want to make it right with the Holt family," he said. "Whatever that requires." She felt something she was careful not to show, a small loosening of something that had been held tight since the moment she walked into that hearing room, not knowing whether the man whose land claim she was challenging was going to be a problem she needed to manage or a person she might be able to work with. This was the second kind. "That would require you to amend your filed claim," she said. "Withdraw the 60-acre overlap and resubmit the corrected boundary. I can prepare the amendment documents if you will provide the authorization." "All right," he said. "You should also know," she said, because she was Fannie Bell and she was thorough, "that Greer may not have acted alone. The original filing has the signatures of 2 witnesses I am not familiar with. I intend to look into them." He looked at her for another moment, and something shifted behind the flatness in his eyes. Not much, not dramatically, but enough that she noticed. "You are a surveyor," he said. It was not a question. It was the sound of a man reorganizing his understanding of something. "A land surveyor and a legal draftsman," she said. "I have been working claims corrections in Kansas since 1870. I have never met a woman surveyor." "Most men haven't," she said evenly. "That does not prevent me from doing the work." The corner of his mouth moved just slightly. If it was the beginning of a smile, it was the most restrained smile she had ever seen, more like the ghost of an impulse than an actual expression. "John Carver," he said, extending his hand. "Fannie Bell," she said, and shook it firmly, the way a professional shakes another professional's hand. She went back to her boarding house room and spread her documents on the table and began drafting the boundary amendment. She worked through the evening by lamplight with the focused efficiency she applied to everything, and she told herself she was not thinking about John Carver and his dark, still eyes and the way he had stood up in that hearing room and said 3 words that had changed the entire shape of the afternoon. She was not entirely telling herself the truth, but she was practiced enough at precision to know the difference between a feeling and a fact, and the feeling was not something she intended to act on. She was here for the Holts. She was here because 60 acres of Kansas grassland belonged to a family that had worked it for 2 years and had nowhere else to go. That was the fact. Everything else was the feeling, and the feeling would keep. 3 days later, John Carver rode out to the Holt homestead. Fannie Bell was already there. She had come the day before to take the final field measurements that would support the amended claim, and she was standing on the west edge of the property with her transit set up on its tripod, sighting along a line toward a stake she had planted 40 yards away when she heard horses. She finished her reading, noted it in her field book, and turned around. John Carver was coming across the creek ford on a gray horse, leading a second horse that was packed with fence materials. Behind him were 2 ranch hands leading a wagon. He pulled up near her transit and looked down at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of surprise, which registered mostly as a slight intensification of his attention. "You are already out here," he said. "Final measurements for the amended filing," she said. "I want the corrected boundary on record before the week is out." He dismounted without a word and walked over to look at the stake she had planted. Then he looked back at where her transit was positioned, tracing the sight line between them. "Exactly on the old fence post corner," he said. "Within 3 inches of it," she said. "Which is why I planted the stake there. The Holt's original boundary followed the natural drainage line here. Your surveyor moved it north. I am moving it back." He stood looking at the stake for a moment. "I had a surveyor in the war," he said. "Engineer Corps. He could read terrain the way other men read newspapers." She looked at him. "You were in the war, 3rd Indiana Cavalry," he said, "until Chickamauga." He said it the way men said the names of the places that had broken them, quietly and without embellishment, as if the word itself contained everything that needed to be said and more. She noted it. She did not press it. "I will have the measurements finished by noon," she said. "The amendment documents should be ready to file by Thursday." He nodded. He and his men began unloading the fence materials. She went back to her transit. They worked in parallel for 2 hours, rarely speaking, on either side of the boundary line. The October sun was generous that morning, and the creek ran clear over its limestone bed, and the cottonwoods along the water had gone gold and copper. Fannie Bell was aware of him in the peripheral way. She was aware of everything when she was working, as a presence that occupied space and therefore had to be accounted for in her spatial calculations. She noted his efficiency without making a production of noting it. He moved the way men moved who were accustomed to hard physical work and who had learned not to waste effort, direct and purposeful and without show. At noon, Thomas Holt came out of the sod house with a pot of coffee and called them both over. They sat at the wooden table outside the sod house in the autumn sun, the four of them, Thomas and his wife Clara and Fannie Bell and John Carver, and it was the first time Fannie had seen John Carver in proximity to another family, and what she saw was something she had not expected. He was not uncomfortable. He did not perform warmth, but he did not perform coldness either. When Clara Holt put the coffee cup in front of him, he said thank you with the simple directness of a man who meant it. When Thomas Holt told him they had not known what they were going to do, that the hearing had been their last recourse, John Carver looked at the table for a moment and then looked up and said, I should have verified my own survey. I am sorry for the trouble it caused you. Thomas Holt, who had lived on the frontier long enough to know that apologies from men like John Carver were rarer and therefore more valuable than silver, received it with the gravity it deserved. You helped when it counted, Holt said. He glanced at Fannie Bell. Both of you. Fannie drove back to Ellsworth that afternoon in the small wagon she rented from the livery stable. The road ran north through the grass, and the sky was enormous and pale blue, and she drove with the easy competence of a woman who had been traveling the Kansas prairie roads alone for 3 years and had no anxiety about it whatsoever. She had stopped being afraid of the loneliness a long time ago. She had a talent for making it useful. But she found herself thinking about John Carver with a frequency that was disproportionate to the professional circumstances. She turned it over in her mind the way she would turn over a calculation that kept coming out differently than she expected, not because the mathematics were wrong, but because she had not yet accounted for all the variables. He was not what she had thought he was when she walked into that hearing room. She had prepared for a man who would be either hostile or dismissive, because in her experience men who held land claims challenged in public courts tended toward one or the other. He had been neither. He had stood up and done the right thing quietly and without requiring either credit or explanation, and then he had come out to the Holt property and put up fence posts on the correct side of the corrected line, as if it were simply the thing a person did when they discovered they had inadvertently wronged someone. She filed the boundary amendment on Thursday as promised. The county sent a notice to Vincent Greer, who resigned his assessorship 3 days later, which told anyone paying attention everything they needed to know about his intentions when he filed the original fraudulent survey. The federal land agent in Abilene wrote to inform Fannie Bell that Greer would be investigated for similar fraudulent filings in 2 other counties, and that her triangulation work had provided the key evidential basis for the investigation. She read the letter twice, neatly folded it, and placed it in her file. Then she went back to work. It was the following week when John Carver knocked on the door of her boarding house office. She had set up one corner of her rented room as a working office, with her drafting table against the window for the light, and she was in the middle of drafting a survey correction for a claim near Smoky Hill when she heard the knock. She opened the door. He was holding his hat in both hands, which she registered as an unconscious gesture of the kind men made when they were somewhere they were uncertain of their footing. I have a survey question, he said. If you have time. Come in, she said, and pulled a second chair to the drafting table. He sat across from her and spread a document on the table, a hand-drawn plat of his full property, all 300 acres of it minus the 60 that had been returned to the Holts. He had marked 3 points on it in pencil. "I want to build a second water hole," he said, "for the south herd. I think the best location is in this valley, but the elevation change concerns me. I'm not sure the water will flow correctly without engineering I am not equipped to do." She leaned over the plat. He had, she saw immediately, a good spatial instinct. The 3 points he had marked were not random. They formed a reasonable preliminary assessment of the terrain. "You read topography," she said. "I read land," he said. "I have been looking at it long enough." "Show me the property," she said. "On the ground, I need to see the natural drainage." He looked up at her. "When?" "Tomorrow if the weather holds." A pause. "All right," he said. They rode out to the Carver ranch the next morning on a clear October day that smelled of dry grass and cold air coming down from the north. He rode the gray horse, and she rode a roan gelding from the livery stable that was somewhat more spirited than she had ordered, but she settled him out in about a quarter mile without any fuss and did not mention it. She noticed John Carver noticed this and not comment on it, which she appreciated. The ranch was larger than she had imagined from the plat documents. 300 acres of mixed grass and creek bottom, properly fenced on the north and east, with a main house that was solid and plain, and told you a great deal about the man who had built it. No decoration, no excess, every element serving a functional purpose. A well-made barn, corrals with good timber, 2 ranch hands whose names were Sam Dwyer and Pete Luca, both of them quiet men who greeted her with the professional courtesy of men whose employer had made clear certain expectations. She spent 4 hours on the south pasture with her instruments, reading the drainage and the fall of the ground. John Carver rode with her and watched her work with an attention that was becoming familiar to her, a kind of concentrated stillness that she had initially read as coldness and was now reading as something quite different, as the particular quality of attention a person gives to something they are genuinely trying to understand. She set up her transit near the natural depression in the South Valley and sighted toward the creek. "Here," she said. "If you excavate to a depth of approximately 6 feet in this location and line the basin with the limestone you have along the east fence line, you will catch the natural subsurface seepage. It will fill in wet season and hold through dry season. The elevation works in your favor because the creek doesn't need to feed it directly. It feeds itself." He walked around the depression, looking at the ground, then at the creek, then back at the depression. "What is the math on that?" he asked. She explained the drainage calculation, the subsurface water table as she read it from the soil type and the vegetation pattern, the relationship between elevation and natural seepage. She spoke precisely and completely, without simplifying it, and he listened with the focused attention of a man who was doing the work of understanding rather than the performance of listening. When she finished, he stood quiet for a moment. "That is the clearest explanation of land drainage I have ever heard," he said. "Most surveyors don't bother explaining," she said. "They expect you to trust the result without understanding the reasoning." "That has been my experience," he said. "I prefer the reasoning." She looked at him. "So do I." They rode back toward the main house in the late afternoon, the sun dropping behind the low hills to the west and turning the grass copper gold. The silence between them had changed from the professional quiet of 2 people working alongside each other to something more layered, the kind of silence that exists between people who are thinking about each other and have not yet decided what to do about it. "Will you stay for supper?" he asked. She considered it. "Yes," she said. It was a simple meal, beef and potatoes and bread that one of the ranch hands had baked that morning. They ate at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and she noticed that he had set the table for 2 with care, the kind of care that a man who lives alone applies to the occasional presence of company because he does not do it often and he wants to do it correctly. They talked about land. They talked about the survey methods she had learned from her father and the improvements in theodolite technology that had come in the years after the war. They talked about the Homestead Act and its actual execution in the field, which was messier and more prone to fraud than its authors had apparently imagined. They talked about Ohio, which was where she was from, and Indiana, which was where he was from, and the way the Midwest prairie felt like a separate country from both. She asked about the war with the specific care of someone who knows they are asking about a scar. He answered briefly, the way he had answered briefly on the survey line. 3rd Indiana Cavalry. He had commanded a company. He had led men at Chickamauga in September of 1863, in a battle where the Union lines had broken disastrously, and men had died in numbers that the official reports made abstractly terrible, but the experience of it made specifically, viscerally, forever terrible. "You lost men," she said. "Not a question." "I lost most of my company," he said. 22 men in one afternoon. He looked at his coffee cup. "I gave the order that put them in the wrong position. I was working from information that turned out to be wrong, but the order was mine." She said nothing for a moment, because she understood that this was not a thing that required response as much as it required witness. He had kept this sealed for 10 years. She could hear the effort in the spare, precise way he described it, the same precision she applied to her own most careful work, controlling the shape of something by controlling the words around it. "That is a weight no one should carry alone," she said finally. He looked up at her. Something happened in his face, not a collapse, not anything dramatic, but the seal cracked just slightly the way limestone cracks along a hidden fault line when the earth shifts, not visibly from the surface until it is already happening. "I have been carrying it alone for 10 years, he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "How do you know that?" "Because of how you held yourself in that hearing room," she said, "before you stood up. You had the look of a man who has been managing himself alone for a very long time and is very good at it." He was quiet. Outside, the Kansas night had come down fully, and the wind moved through the grass with its particular low sound, and the lamp between them threw its warm light into the angles of his face. "You are very observant," he said. "It is a professional requirement," she said, "and a personal habit." The corner of his mouth moved again, and this time it was a full, albeit small, smile. It changed his face entirely. It made him look like someone who had once known how to smile easily, and was rediscovering that it was still possible. She rode back to Ellsworth that night under a sky full of stars, and she told herself again that she was being practical, that she was building a professional relationship with a client whose land claim she had helped correct, and that the warmth in her chest was simply the satisfaction of a complicated job done correctly. She was telling herself less truth with every repetition of this argument. John Carver came into town the following Saturday. He did not come for any stated reason that she could identify. He came into the land office where she was conferring with one of the attorneys she worked with, a measured man named Caldwell who had learned to trust her calculations implicitly, and he waited in the outer room until she was finished, and then he asked if she would like to walk with him. She said yes before she had entirely decided to. They walked down the main street of Ellsworth in the October afternoon, past the dry goods store and the saddle maker and the bank and the feed store, and people looked at them with the unashamed directness of a frontier town, which had less social pretense than an eastern city, but no less appetite for observing its neighbors. Fannie Bell was known in Ellsworth. John Carver was known in Ellsworth. The two of them together were clearly going to be a topic of conversation before sundown. She found she did not particularly mind. He had brought a question about the waterhole excavation, a practical question about limestone lining depth and the best method for measuring the excavation floor for proper drainage, and she answered it as they walked, explaining the method clearly and efficiently, and he listened with the attention she was now accustomed to and asked 2 precise follow-up questions that demonstrated he had understood everything she said. She looked at him sideways. "You could have written that question in a note," she said. "I could have," he agreed, "but you came into town instead." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. The directness of this was somehow more affecting than any elaborate explanation would have been. She was a person who appreciated directness. She had spent years dealing with men who could not say plainly what they meant and wanted her to infer it, and it had made her weary of indirection in all its forms. "I have a question for you," she said. "Go ahead. What do you actually want from the land?" she asked. "Not the practical details, the larger ambition. Why 300 acres in Kansas?" He thought about this for a long moment, which was another thing she was coming to appreciate about him. He did not answer quickly when a question deserved a considered response. "After the war I needed to build something," he said. "I had spent 4 years in service of destroying things, even when the cause was right. I needed to put my hands to work that made something rather than unmade it." He looked at the street ahead of them. "Land is the most honest thing I know how to work with. You put effort into it and it responds in proportion. It does not lie to you." She felt this land in her own chest in a specific way. "My father said something similar," she said. "He said a survey is just the land telling you the truth about itself, and your job is to listen accurately." He turned to look at her. "That is exactly right," he said, with the particular quiet conviction of a man who has recognized something he has been trying to articulate for a long time. They reached the end of the street and turned back without discussing it. The sun was getting low, throwing long golden shadows from the false fronts of the storefronts. She was aware of the warmth of him walking beside her, the specific physical reality of a person close enough to touch, which was a thing she had been carefully not specifically aware of until this moment. "My father also told me," she said, "that the land does not care who measures it. It is accurate for anyone who is skilled enough to read it." He looked at her with a faint smile. "He was trying to tell you that your work was as legitimate as anyone else's." "He was preparing me for the alternative opinion," she said, "which I have encountered more than occasionally." "In my experience," John Carver said quietly, "skill is skill. A man who refuses to see it because of who holds it is a fool, and fools lose their land." She stopped walking. He stopped too and looked at her. "That is the most sensible thing anyone has said to me in years about my profession," she said. He looked at her with those dark, still eyes, and the sealed quality she had noticed in them had loosened further since the night at the kitchen table. There was something there now that was present in a way it had not been before. Not vulnerable, he was too controlled for that, but open. The way a window is open that has been shut for a long time. "I have a proposal," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Professional," he said quickly, and she thought she saw a flicker of something in his expression. Not embarrassment exactly, but the awareness of the word he had chosen and its other meanings. "I am going to need survey work done on the expanded grazing area I am developing north of the creek. I would rather hire someone whose work I have already seen than someone I have not. I am prepared to offer a fair rate." She considered it. "What is your timeline?" "Spring planting is when I want the new fencing in," he said. "So the survey would need to be done before winter sets the ground." "That gives me 3 to 4 weeks," she said. "I can do it." "Good," he said. "John," she said, and his name in her mouth was something she had not done before, not informally, not with the simplicity of a person talking to someone they have decided to know rather than to work alongside. He looked at her steadily. "I will not be employed by anyone," she said. "I am an independent professional. I work on contract and I set my own terms. If those terms are acceptable to you, we have an agreement." He did not miss a beat. "Those terms are entirely acceptable," he said. "Then we have an agreement," she said. They shook hands again as they had outside the hearing room, but something about it was different this time. The length of the grip, perhaps, or the fact that neither of them moved away from it immediately, and the October air around them seemed to have gone very still. She went back to her boarding house room and sat at her drafting table without lighting the lamp for a while, watching the last of the daylight move across the wall, and she thought about the fact that her life had always been organized around work, around the precision and clarity of measured things, and that this new variable she was carrying had the specific quality of something that would not be measured away no matter how carefully she tried. She lit the lamp. She went back to work. The North Range survey took 3 weeks. She went out to the Carver ranch every Monday and Thursday and worked the property systematically, moving from east to west in survey runs of half a mile, using the creek as her baseline and working outward from it. John Carver rode with her most days. He did not ride with her in the way of a man who needed to supervise or who could not stay away, but in the way of a man who found the work genuinely interesting and who had realized that being near her was something he had organized his week around without quite admitting it. On the second Thursday, they were working the north fence line when a cold front came through faster than either of them had expected, the sky turning the particular greenish-gray that on the Kansas prairie means the weather is serious and intentions are being stated. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in about 20 minutes. She was in the middle of a sight reading and refused to abandon it, and so they were 1.5 miles from the house when the first sleet came in sideways. "We need to go," he said. "Give me 2 minutes," she said, and finished her reading, noting it in her field book with her fingers already going stiff in the cold. He had the horses ready when she came back from the transit, and he handed her reins to her with the practiced efficiency of a man who has managed horses in bad weather and knows that the next thing to do is simply the next thing to do. They rode hard back toward the house, the sleet cutting in from the northwest, and she rode without hesitation or complaint, leaning into the wind with the calm of a woman who has spent years on the Kansas prairie and knows that weather is simply a condition you navigate and not a catastrophe you perform anxiety about. They came into the barn at a canter and dismounted in the warm, hay-smelling interior while the sleet rattled the roof. She was pulling her gloves off and checking her field book to make sure the pages had stayed dry when she realized he was watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Most people would have left the instrument. The measurement would have been lost," she said. "I don't lose measurements." He made a sound that was just short of a laugh, surprised out of him, and she looked up to see his expression, and what was on his face was so unguarded and warm and full of something he had not yet named aloud that she felt her own breath catch. She looked down at her field book. "I will need to wait out the sleet before I can drive back," she said. "You will stay for supper," he said. Not a question exactly, not entirely a statement either, something offered with the restraint of a man who is not entirely sure of his welcome. "Yes," she said. "All right." Pete Luca had a stew going when they came in from the barn, and they ate in the kitchen again, the three of them this time, and after Pete went to the bunkhouse, it was just the two of them at the table with the sleet outside and the lamp between them and the warmth of the stove behind her. "Tell me about Ohio," he said. "What you remember." She talked about her father's office, the smell of paper and ink, the way survey documents covered every flat surface, the particular quality of light in Ohio winters, which was gray and soft in a way that Kansas winters were not. She talked about learning to use the transit in the field with her father on survey runs along the Ohio River, the way he had always spoken to her as a professional in training rather than as a child, the specific respect of that. She talked about the loneliness after he died, the particular isolation of a woman in a man's profession, the way she had learned to make her competence so irrefutable that the argument against her was simply too expensive to maintain. He listened to all of it. He did not once suggest that she might have found things easier if she had chosen a different path. He did not qualify her experience with the experiences of women who had made different choices. He simply listened, with the specific quality of attention that is itself a form of acknowledgement. "You are the most impressive person I have met since before the war," he said quietly when she finished. She looked at him. "I mean that entirely professionally," he said, "and not entirely professionally. Both of those things are true, and I am aware that one of them may not be welcome." The directness of it again, the specific honest directness, struck her in the chest like the cold had not. "It is welcome," she said. "I am not sure what to do with it, but it is welcome." He looked at the table. Something in his face was doing the work of a man who is approaching a thing he has kept at a distance for a long time and is deciding whether the approach is safe. "I have not allowed myself to want anything," he said. "That was not strictly practical. since the war. It seemed reasonable to limit myself to what I could control. And things you want, she said carefully, are not controllable. No, he said, they are not. She thought about what she wanted to say for a moment. Neither is a survey, she said. You take the measurements, you accept what the land tells you. You do not argue with the results because they are inconvenient. He raised his eyes to hers, and what was in them was no longer sealed at all. No, he said softly. You do not. Outside, the sleet had turned to snow. She stayed the night in the house's spare room, which was plain and clean, and had a quilt on the bed that looked as if someone had made it a long time ago with care and skill. She lay awake for a while listening to the snow on the roof, and the warm sounds of the house settling, and thinking about a man who had sealed himself away from want for 10 years, and was finding, apparently, that want had not sealed itself away in return. She was 31 years old. She had made choices about her life that had left very little room in them for another person, because another person required compromise and adjustment and vulnerability. And those were things she had learned to regard with caution, because she had seen what happened when women made their lives dependent on the goodwill of others. She had built her independence with the same precision she applied to her surveys, deliberately and comprehensively. She was not afraid of John Carver. She was afraid of what she felt about John Carver, because it was large and specific and not going to be useful to dismiss. She closed her eyes and slept. In the morning, the snow had lightened to a dusting that covered the brown grass like a thin cloth. She found him at the barn when she came out, already seeing to the horses, and he handed her a cup of coffee he had brought from the house without preamble, as if this were already an established practice between them. She drank it standing in the barn doorway, watching the pale winter light on the snow. I need to finish the North Range measurements, she said. Tomorrow, if the ground allows, he said. Tomorrow. She drove back to Ellsworth in the clear, cold morning, and she found herself smiling at nothing in particular as the road unrolled through the snow-dusted grass, which was not something she was in the habit of. She finished the North Range survey by the middle of November, and prepared the complete plat document for the expanded grazing area, a work she was privately proud of because the topography had been complex, and she had handled it precisely. She delivered it to the Carver ranch on a Tuesday afternoon and spread it on the kitchen table and walked him through it, and he followed every point with the attention she had come to rely on. When she was done, he looked at it for a long time. This is remarkable work, he said. It is accurate work, she said. That is what it should be. Fannie. He said her name the way you say a name when you have been thinking about saying it for a while with a specific care. She looked up. I would like to ask you to dinner, he said. Not as a client, as a man asking a woman he greatly admires if she would spend an evening in his company. She felt the warmth of it in her face and made no effort to suppress it, because she was done suppressing things that were simply true. Yes, she said. I would like that. He took her to dinner at the Ellsworth Hotel dining room that Friday, which was the finest establishment in town, and required a reservation and a relatively clean coat, both of which he had arranged without apparent difficulty. She wore her best dress, a dark green wool that she had made herself 2 years ago and wore very seldom, and she put her hair up with more care than she usually gave it. And when she looked at herself in the small mirror of her boarding-house room, she thought, without vanity but with simple accuracy, that she looked like a woman who was happy. She could not remember the last time she had made that specific observation about herself. He met her at the hotel door, and he had made an effort of his own, a good coat and a proper shirt, and a face that had been recently shaved. And when she walked up and he looked at her, his expression had the kind of uncomplicated feeling in it that she had been watching for months emerge slowly from behind all that practiced control, and it was worth everything the emergence had cost. You look beautiful, he said simply, and she was glad he had said it simply because it was how she would have wanted him to say it. Thank you, she said. You look very well yourself. They ate a long dinner and talked about everything, and nothing with the ease of two people who have been talking for months, and have realized that conversation with each other is something they do not want to end. He told her about Indiana as a boy, about his father's farm, about the particular smell of Indiana in late summer, and the way the war had taken him from that, and then given him back to a world that was recognizable but not entirely the same as the one he had left. She told him about the first survey job she had done entirely alone after her father died, a property line dispute near Columbus, the nervous precision of getting everything right when there was no one to check her work. After dinner, they walked in the Ellsworth Street under a sky that had cleared to a vast, star-heavy winter darkness, and he offered her his arm and she took it, and they walked in the cold with the warmth of each other's company around them like something built rather than borrowed. He stopped them on the boardwalk near the end of the main street, in the place where the lamplight from the last storefront ended and the dark began. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I have not wanted to be careful about anyone in a long time," he said. "I had made my peace with that, or I thought I had." He looked at her with the honest directness she had come to love about him. "I was wrong about having made peace with it. I know that now because I am very careful about you." "Careful in what sense?" she asked. "In the sense that I do not want to say the wrong thing," he said, "or do the wrong thing, or give you reason to think that I see anything in you other than exactly what you are." "What do you see?" she asked. "A woman of extraordinary competence and integrity," he said, "who is kind in ways she does not advertise, who is braver than she gives herself credit for, and she already gives herself considerable credit." A pause. "And who I think about constantly, and have since the moment you stood up in that hearing room and said what needed to be said." Looked at him in the Kansas night. "I think about you constantly too," she said, in the spirit of being precise about things. He reached out and took her hand in both of his, the same hand she had shaken twice in professional contexts, and held it with a care that was different from anything professional and everything personal. "I am going to make you a different kind of proposal than the last one," he said. She felt her heart doing something unreasonable in her chest. "I am listening," she said. "Would you allow me to court you?" he said. "Properly, with the intention of asking, eventually, a more permanent question. I am not a man given to doing things by halves when I have decided they matter." She was quiet for a moment. The stars were very bright. The Kansas wind moved through the grass beyond the edge of town. "I need you to understand something first," she said. "I will not give up my work, my surveying, my professional practice. It is not separate from who I am. Any arrangement we might eventually discuss would have to accommodate that as an absolute. I would not have it any other way," he said. "Your work is part of what I admire about you. I would consider myself a significant fool if I asked you to set aside the thing that makes you most yourself." She thought about what her father had told her once, when she was 17 and worried about what her future looked like, that the right person would recognize the value in her that the wrong people tried to diminish. She had believed him then with the faith of a girl. She believed him now with the evidence of a woman. "Yes," she said, "you may court me properly." He smiled, the full smile she had seen so rarely and treasured each time, and squeezed her hand, and they walked back through the cold Kansas night with the stars overhead and the grass on all sides and the town's warm lights ahead of them. And Fannie Bell thought that the landscape of her life, which she had surveyed so carefully for so long, had just developed a new feature she had not mapped before, and she was glad she had not mapped it before, because some things were better discovered than planned. The courtship that followed was the kind that happens between two people who are both serious and busy, and who come to an understanding that time spent together is valuable, and therefore should be spent well. He came to town every Saturday, and they had dinner or walked or sat in the hotel parlor and talked. She went to the ranch every week for work and occasionally not for work, and the line between the two shifted slowly and pleasantly as November turned to December, and the Kansas winter came down in earnest. He told her more about the war, bit by bit, on evenings when the lamplight was warm and the room was quiet, and the door that had been sealed began, carefully and in small increments, to open. He told her about the men of his company by name, one at a time over the course of several evenings, as if he were completing a responsibility he had owed them for 10 years, the responsibility of being witnessed. She listened to all of it with the complete and specific attention she gave to things that mattered. One evening in December, he described the day of Chickamauga in full for the first time, the whole terrible afternoon of it, the false information and the impossible order and the sound of it. And when he finished, he sat with his eyes on the table for a long moment in the silence of a man who has put down something very heavy and does not quite know what his hands feel like without it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. Neither of them spoke for a while. They did not need to. "You have been carrying their names," she said at last. "Yes," he said. "You can put them down," she said. "Not forget them. Just put down the carrying of them as a punishment. You made a decision in impossible circumstances with false information. You are not the man who killed them. You are the man who survived them and built something decent in their memory." He looked at her with his eyes clear in a way she had not seen them before, clear the way water is clear when the silt has finally settled. "I have been waiting," he said slowly, "for someone who understood the difference between guilt and grief." "They are not the same thing," she said. "Grief is right. Guilt without basis is just a way of punishing yourself past the point of usefulness." He turned her hand in his and looked at it, the small, capable hand of a woman who had spent years using it to measure the truth of the world. "You are remarkable," he said. "I told you that before. I intend to keep telling you." "I accept it with reasonable grace," she said, which made him laugh, fully and easily, the laugh of a man who has not laughed like that in a long time. By Christmas the whole of Ellsworth knew they were together, in the specific and thorough way that small frontier towns know their inhabitants' business. The Holt family, who considered Fannie Bell something close to patron saint, regarded John Carver with the measured approval of people who credit a man with the right things for the right reasons. The two land attorneys she worked with offered careful congratulations. Even the federal land agent in Abilene, who was not given to personal commentary, managed a brief note of best wishes when she wrote to him about a survey case that mentioned the Carver ranch tangentially. On Christmas morning he came to the boarding house with a small package wrapped in paper and tied with string, and inside it was a new field book, leather-bound and fine, with her name tooled into the cover, F.A. Bell, in a style she recognized as the work of the saddle maker on the main street who did excellent leather work. She looked at it for a long time. "The A stands for Augusta," she said. "My grandmother's name." "I know," he said. "You mentioned it once in October. I was paying attention." She looked up at him. "You were paying attention in October." "I was paying attention from the beginning," he said. "From the moment you stood up in that hearing room, I was paying attention to everything." She held the field book in both hands. "This is the best gift anyone has ever given me," she said quietly. "Good," he said simply. She gave him a present she had made herself, a proper bound copy of the North Range survey, beautifully drafted and annotated, with a note on the inside cover that read, "For a man who reads land as honestly as it reads him." He held it in the same way she had held the field book. They had Christmas dinner at the hotel with Thomas and Clara Holt and their children, all 6 of them crowded around a table in the hotel dining room, with the management's slightly strained goodwill for the occasion. And it was the warmest Christmas Fannie Bell could remember since her father was alive. Warm not because of the food or the room, but because of the specific and precious thing of being known. January passed with the particular severity of Kansas winters, which could kill you if you were careless and merely made you very uncomfortable if you were not. She worked through it, moving between Ellsworth and the ranches in the county with the stoic efficiency of a woman accustomed to weather as a condition of life. He proposed in February, not with fanfare, not with an elaborate setting. They were at the ranch, sitting at the kitchen table after a long day she had spent re-examining a survey discrepancy she had found in a neighboring claim, and the evening was cold and the lamp was warm, and he had made coffee, and they were sitting across from each other in the comfortable silence they had developed, and he looked at her with clear, unguarded eyes and said, "Fannie, I want you to marry me. I want to spend my life being present for yours. I want this to be our table and this to be our lamp, and whatever work you do and wherever it takes you, I want to be the person you come home to." She felt the full weight of it, the absolute sincerity of a man who had survived terrible things and built something good and was now offering her the most genuine part of himself. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I want that too." He reached across the table and she took his hand and they sat in the lamplight for a moment with the simple, enormous fact of it between them. Then she looked at him with the precision she could not suppress even in her most personal moments. "I will keep my professional name in my work," she said. "Fannie Bell, my father's name. It is on my established record and it is how I am known in the field." "Fannie Bell Carver in everything personal," he said, "and Fannie Bell in everything professional. That is perfectly reasonable." "You are perfectly reasonable," she said, "which I consider an exceptional quality." He squeezed her hand. "You are going to be an extraordinary thing to have in my life." "Yes," she said, "I am, and you in mine." They were married in April of 1874 in Ellsworth, at the small Methodist church on the north side of town, in a ceremony attended by the Holt family, both land attorneys, Pete Luca and Sam Dwyer from the ranch, the boarding house landlady who had housed Fannie for 3 years and had opinions about everything, and several other people from the county who had worked with one or both of them and wanted to be present for the occasion. Fannie Bell wore a dress she had made herself from a cream-colored wool that she had ordered from a dry goods catalog in January and waited for through the winter, and she had it fitted with a simplicity of line that suited her exactly, and she carried a small bunch of prairie wildflowers that Clara Holt had somehow found and arranged. She walked up the aisle of the church on her own 2 feet because her father was gone, and she had no one to give her away and did not require giving, and the man waiting for her at the front was the man she had chosen with the full precision of everything she was. John Carver, watching her walk toward him, looked like a man who could not entirely believe his good fortune. He looked like a man in whom the long, cold, sealed interior had been opened and warmed and filled with something he had stopped believing was possible. He looked like a man who was, quietly and absolutely, home. They exchanged vows with the simple Kansas honesty of the kind they both preferred, and when the minister pronounced them married, he kissed her with a restrained tenderness that said everything about who he was and how he regarded her, and the small congregation made the sounds that small congregations make when they are genuinely, uncomplicated happy for 2 people. Thomas Holt shook John Carver's hand for a long time. Clara Holt cried, prettily and without embarrassment. Pete Luca looked proud in the way that good men look when good things happen to the people they work for. Sam Dwyer brought a bottle of whiskey that nobody asked about, and that was extensively appreciated at the small reception that followed at the hotel. Fannie Bell became, in April of 1874, Fannie Bell Carver in all the ways that mattered and Fannie Bell in all the ways that also mattered, which is to say she became herself completely, which was the only kind of becoming she had ever wanted. They went back to the ranch as the sun was going down, just the 2 of them driving together in the wagon along the road through the spring grass, which had come in green and bright after the winter, and the creek was running full with snowmelt, and the sky was the particular intense blue that Kansas produces in spring, as if apologizing for January. She looked at the land as they drove, reading it the way she always did, the drainage and the elevation and the shape of things, and she thought that it was the most beautiful survey she had ever seen. He was watching her. "You are reading the land," he said. "I always read the land," she said. "What does it tell you?" She looked at it for a moment. "That it is exactly as it should be," she said. "Which is the best thing a survey can tell you." He reached over and took her hand on the wagon seat, holding it loosely in the way of a man who has understood that he does not need to hold on tightly, that the person beside him is there by choice and will go on choosing. The ranch was theirs in the fullest sense from that evening. Not the legal sense, which had been established in the deed, but the lived sense, the sense in which a place becomes a home not when the papers are signed, but when two people who belong together are in it together. She moved her professional office to a room in the ranch house that had good north light from 2 windows, and she set up her drafting table there, and her instrument cases and her file boxes. And it looked exactly the way her boarding house office had looked, and also completely different, because it was no longer the office of a woman living on her own terms in rented space, but of a woman living on her own terms in a place that was also a home. In the years that followed, she continued her survey work throughout Caldwell County and into 2 neighboring counties. She helped 23 additional families correct fraudulent or erroneous land filings. She worked with the federal land agent in Abilene on a comprehensive audit of Greer's other filings that resulted in corrective action in 9 separate cases. She was, by the late 1870s, known in the professional land records world of Kansas as one of the most reliable survey correctors in the region, which meant she was known in that world more extensively than most people are known in any world. She did this work with her husband's absolute support, which was not the lavish public support of a man performing progressiveness, but the quiet, practical support of a man who had organized the ranch operations to accommodate her schedule, who had learned to prepare a decent meal for the evenings she worked late, and who had, on 2 occasions when clients came to the ranch office, and expressed surprise at finding a woman in charge of the professional work, looked at them with a flatness in his eyes that communicated in the clearest possible terms that they were welcome to take their business elsewhere. Neither of them had. He expanded the ranch through honest work and careful management, adding 120 acres to the north in 1875, and developing the water hole she had helped him locate in the south pasture into an efficient watering system for the whole of the south herd. The ranch became one of the better-regarded cattle operations in the county, not the largest but one of the best managed, which reflected both his judgment and the fact that he had an excellent surveyor on the premises who could tell him exactly what the land would support. They argued sometimes, as serious-minded people who hold their own views do, and they argued the way they did everything else, directly and honestly and without weaponizing each other's vulnerabilities, and they resolved arguments with the willingness of 2 people who would rather reach a good conclusion than win a position. He talked about the war more as the years passed, not often, and it never became easy exactly, but it became something he could carry differently. He had put down the guilt, or most of it. He kept the grief, which was the right thing to do, the necessary human thing. He had named a field on the North Range after the men of his company, a private notation on the ranch survey documents that only he and Fannie knew about, and he rode out there sometimes on September mornings, which was when the battle had been, and stayed for a while. She never asked him what he did out there. He knew she understood. Their son was born in March of 1876, a boy they named Robert Thomas Carver, the Robert for Fannie's father, and the Thomas for the man whose land she had helped save before any of this began. He was a loud and opinionated infant who grew into a loud and opinionated toddler with his mother's mathematical mind, showing itself early in the form of an obsessive interest in measuring everything in the house with a piece of string. Fannie Bell watched this with the specific delight of a person seeing something they love replicated in a new form. A girl came 2 years later, in the spring of 1878, and they named her Clara after the woman who had brought wildflowers to a wedding and wept with uncomplicated happiness. Clara was quieter than Robert and more watchful, with her father's quality of deep, still attention, and she was 6 months old before they knew what to do with her, and then entirely indispensable. Thomas Holt, at the christening, looked at the two children and then at the two parents and said something privately to John Carver that made him nod once with the look of a man who has been told something he already knows. "He said we changed everything," John told Fannie later. "He changed things too," she said. "By having the courage to bring his paperwork to someone who could read it. He said that as well," John said. "He is a perceptive man." "He is," she said. "We should have them for dinner next week. I will ask Pete to make that stew," he said. "The Holts seem to like it." "Everyone likes Pete's stew," she said. He put his arm around her at the kitchen table where they were sitting after the children were in bed, and she leaned into the warmth of him. And outside the Kansas night was enormous and full of stars, and the creek ran over its limestone bed in the dark, and the spring grass was coming in and the North Range was green, and the survey documents in her office were precisely accurate, and the world was, in the specific and measurable way she trusted most, exactly what it should be. In 1879, the year Robert turned 3 and Clara was walking and getting into everything, Vincent Greer died in Abilene of a heart complaint. The local paper mentioned it briefly. Fannie read the notice and then set the paper down and thought of the 14 families from the early correction cases and the 23 after and the 9 from the audit. And she thought that the world had a way of adjusting its own accounts, eventually and imperfectly, but eventually. "Greer died," she told John that evening. "I saw the notice," he said, a pause. "Do you have any feeling about it?" he thought. "I have the feeling that the land records of Caldwell County are in somewhat better shape than they were when he was filing them," he said. "That seems like the appropriate response." She agreed entirely. The decade that followed was full of work and children and the specific daily texture of a life built honestly on good ground. Robert showed an early aptitude for numbers that his mother encouraged with methodical intensity, and by the time he was 8, he could read a simple plat and was deeply proud of this fact. Clara, as she grew, revealed herself to be her father's daughter in the way she moved through the land, reading it with an instinct that she had not been taught but simply had. And John Carver took her riding with him on the property from the time she was 4 and talked to her about what the grass told him and what the creek told him, and she listened with her watchful dark eyes and stored it all. Fannie Bell's professional reputation, by the early 1880s, had extended beyond Kansas. She had correspondence with land surveyors in Nebraska and Colorado. She was asked twice to provide testimony in federal land cases, which she did with the precise, unadorned clarity of a professional who understands that the facts, properly presented, require no embellishment. A land attorney in Topeka who had read about the Greer case wrote to ask if she would be willing to consult on a large-scale fraud case involving railroad land grants, and she spent 3 months in 1882 working that case, staying in Topeka during the week and coming home on weekends. And John Carver managed the ranch, and the children with the competent, unglamorous dedication of a man who had understood from the beginning that this was what partnership meant. He was 43 by then, still broad and strong and angular, and his hair had begun to gray at the temples in a way she found exactly right, and she told him so with the same directness she applied to everything, which made him smile in that full and specific way she had first seen in November of 1873 and had never been able to look at without the warmth of it in her own chest. "You are partial," he said. "I am precise," she said. "Those are different things." He kissed her with the ease of long practice and the warmth of a feeling that had not diminished in 9 years and showed no sign of doing so. They had a third child in 1883, a second son, named James, because they had run out of family names they felt obligated to use, and James was a name that John had always liked without being able to explain why, which Fannie considered sufficient justification. James was from the beginning a person of remarkable stubbornness and charm in roughly equal measure, and the household adjusted to include him with the flexible good humor of a family that had found its own particular rhythm and could accommodate variation within it. Robert, by now 7, appointed himself his younger brother's primary educator in all matters, a role he took with absolute seriousness and moderate competence. Clara, at 5, watched James with the same watchful attention she gave to everything, and seemed to have reached her own conclusions about him, which she kept to herself. Fannie Bell sat at her drafting table on a Sunday morning in the autumn of 1883, with the north light through the windows and the house making the sounds of a family at its business around her, James somewhere in the back rooms with John's voice answering questions. Clara in the yard she could see from the window, Robert's boots on the stairs, and she looked at the survey document she was preparing, and then at the window, and then at the specific and complete shape of the life she had built, which was the most accurate survey she had ever done. She thought about a hearing room in October of 1873, a cold man at the front table, 30 men's silence, and the things she had needed to say, and the choice she had made to stand up and say it. She thought about the specific quality of his eyes when he turned to look at her, the flatness in them that was not coldness but containment, and the moment in the hearing room when he said 3 words and the afternoon changed shape, and all the moments after that which had been the story of that shape changing into something she had not planned and would not have traded for anything precisely plannable. She thought about her father's voice telling her that a survey is just the land telling you the truth about itself and your job is to listen accurately. She had listened accurately. She had measured what was there and not what she wished were there, and what was there had turned out to be vast and good and right on the measurements. John appeared in the doorway of the office with coffee. She looked up at him. He had James on his hip, the boy apparently having decided that the doorway of the survey office was the most interesting place in the house at this particular moment. John was looking at her with the expression she knew better than anything, the one that was not sealed anymore, that had been open for 10 years now, that held in it the full and unguarded fact of what she was to him. "Coffee," he said, "if you want to take a moment." She capped her ink pen and set it down. "I want to take a moment," she said. She took the coffee cup, and he came into the office and sat in the second chair, the one that had always been there for him, and James immediately attempted to access the field book stacked on the lower shelf, and John redirected him with the practiced ease of a man who had learned the specific strategies required by each of his children. And the autumn sun came in through the north windows and lay across the survey documents and the drafting instruments and the leather field book with her name tooled into the cover, F.A. Bell, still there on the shelf where she kept it, still in use after a decade. Outside the window the land ran out to the creek, and beyond it to the north range with the field that had the private name she knew, and the grass was the gold brown of October again, and the sky was that blue that Kansas produces in autumn to remind you of what it can do when it tries. John Carver, who had been the coldest man at a land hearing in October of 1873, sat in his wife's office in October of 1883 and held their youngest child in his lap and watched her drink her coffee with the open, warm, completely unguarded expression of a man who had been found, not in the evangelical sense or the sentimental sense, but in the most precise sense, the sense she would have recognized immediately as the correct one. He had been lost in a sealed country of his own making, bounded by guilt and grief, and the practiced habit of requiring nothing from the world that the world could take away. And she had walked into a hearing room with her mathematics and her courage and her refusal to leave until the truth was on the record. And she had cracked something open in him that he had thought sealed permanently. And what had poured out of that crack had not been damage after all but the capacity for this. For the coffee and the children and the autumn light, and the woman at the drafting table who was the most precise and honest and extraordinary person he had ever known. "What are you thinking?" she asked, looking at him over the rim of her cup. "That I am the most fortunate man in Kansas," he said. "Arguable," she said, "but I accept the sentiment." He smiled, the full smile, the one that still changed his face entirely. "Fannie," he said. "John," she said. James found a field book and presented it to them both with the triumph of discovery. Outside, the October sun moved across the Kansas grass, and the creek ran over its limestone bed, and the land told the truth about itself the way it always had, for anyone skilled enough and honest enough and brave enough to listen. Which was, as it had always been, everything.